Dallas, and I'm very happy to open the McDermott Conference on Saving Western Civilization, one student at a time. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our panel discussions. The first panel will focus on political and cultural challenges we are facing with respect to Western civilization. The second panel will then address the promise of classical education in this particular context. This panel will start at 3:30 p.m. and we'll have a little break in between with some refreshments served outside. I hope you will join us again tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. in this very same room for our keynote lecture offered by Rabbi Mark Gottlieb on Saving Western Civilization, one student at a time, some lessons from Jewish and Catholic educational leaders. In 1974, the University of Dallas established the Eugene McDermott Lectureship, an endowed lectureship series created in honor of Eugene McDermott, the late scientist, businessman, civic leader, and philanthropist. The lectureship was established on behalf of Mrs. and Mr. Eugene McDermott to honor Donald and Louise Cohen's vision and leadership at the University of Dallas and in the city of Dallas. Notable members of the McDermott Lectureship family include Hans-Georg Gadamer, Mortimer Adler, Paul Ricoeur, Alan Bloom, Leon Kass, Francis Cardinal Arinze, Michael Gorbachev, and General Colin Powell, among many other notables. Through the McDermott Lectureship, the University of Dallas and the Braniff Graduate School of Liberal Arts host exceptional guests and distinguished faculty members on thought-provoking topics within the Western tradition. It is my pleasure now to introduce the panelists of our first round of reflections and conversations on saving Western civilization, one student at a time. I start with Rabbi Mark Gottlieb, the third to my left from this end side. Rabbi Mark Gottlieb is the Chief Education Officer of the Tikvah Fund and founding Dean of the Tikvah Scholars Program. Prior to joining Tikvah, Rabbi Gottlieb served as head of school at Yeshiva University High School for Boys and principal of the Maimonides School in Brooklyn, Massachusetts. And he taught at the Frisch School, the Ida Crown Jewish Academy, Hebrew Theological College, Loyola University in Chicago, and the University of Chicago. He received his BA from Yeshiva College, his rabbinical ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, and an MA in philosophy from the University of Chicago. There, his doctoral studies focused on the moral and political thought of Alasdair MacIntyre. Our second speaker is Dr. Jonathan Sanford, sitting second to my left. Dr. Jonathan Sanford is the 10th president of the University of Dallas, having assumed the position in 2021. A tenured professor in the philosophy department, he graduated summa cum laude from Xavier University in Ohio with a degree in classical languages and philosophy, received his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Buffalo, and a postdoctoral fellowship from Fordham University. Dr. Sanford is an active scholar and has published widely on philosophical thinkers and topics, especially on foundational questions of moral philosophy. Our third speaker today, to the far left on this end of the table, is Mr. Eric Cohen. Eric Cohen has been the executive director of the Tikvah Fund since 2007. He was the founder and remains editor-at-large of the New Atlantis, and he serves as the publisher of Mosaic. Mr. Cohen has published in numerous academic and popular journals, magazines, and newspapers. He is the author of In the Shadow of Progress, Being Human in the Age of Technology. And he's co-editor of The Future is Now, America Confronts the New Genetics. Mr. Cohen was previously managing editor of The Public Interest and served as a senior consultant to the President's Council on Bioethics. Mr. Cohen currently serves on the board of directors of the Ethics and Public Policy Institute, or Center, the Witherspoon Institute, and National Affairs, and on the editorial advisory board of First Things. Finally, to my immediate left, Dr. Richard Dougherty. Dr. Dougherty is a professor in the Department of Politics at the University of Dallas and Dean of the Braniff Graduate School of Liberal Arts. Dean Dougherty received his BA from Belmont Abbey College in North Carolina and his MA and PhD from the University of Dallas's Institute of Philosophic Studies. His research and teaching interests are in medieval political philosophy, especially the thought of St. Augustine, natural law theory, the American presidency, and Catholic political and social thought. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Without further ado, I would like to pass over the staff to Rabbi Mark Gottlieb to start us off in our reflections on saving Western civilization one student at a time.
Thank you so much, Matthias, for the warm welcome. With your permission, I will defer my fuller thanks and words of gratitude until tomorrow night to the lecture, but I'd be remiss if I didn't simply say how honored and humbled I am to be here with all of you for this event and for the series of events over the next couple of days. Professor Sanford, for your graciousness and your friendship over the years. It's an honor to be on a panel with these distinguished gentlemen, and I look forward to the next couple of days of conversation with all of you. So history, both ancient and modern, has produced a number of authors belonging to the Jewish people who were nevertheless more welcomed or found a better, more sympathetic home amongst their Gentile readership. You all know the names here. I don't have to go into much detail, but just for starters, Matthew, Mark, John, Paul. I think more recently, this list would include the philosopher Spinoza and two much beloved 20th century theologians, Martin Buber and Abraham Joshua Heschel. Don't get me wrong, Jews love the latter two theologians as well, but they really have found, I would say, a much more fertile home in Christian circles. Now, we could account for that fact in numerous ways, and we probably could spend a lot of time. It would be the subject of its own distinct doctoral dissertation. Probably has already happened, I imagine. But we won't do that this afternoon. Instead, I want to just pick up one theme, one particular theme, really one genre from Buber, which I think is especially important for religious formation, religious education, and especially of the youth. Along the way, we'll have something to say of Jewish and Catholic approaches to religious formation. But I want to dwell for a couple of minutes on the role of story with a capital S, if you will. Interestingly, Buber's publishing history, in 1937, his most famous philosophical personalist tract, I and Thou, was translated, Ich and Du. But much more popular, at least in Jewish circles, was his book called Tales of the Hasidim, which was a collection, an anthology of very homey stories, parables about Hasidic life in 18th and 19th century Pale of Settlement Russia. And I think the popularity of Tales of Hasidim over I and Thou is actually instructive because it gives us a window into the power of narrative even over creed and law. And it's at this point that I want to mention a friend of mine, Michael Weingrad. Michael is now a visiting professor at Hillsdale, but in 2010, he published for the inaugural issue of the Jewish Review of Books, and I know that Eric remembers this because he was copy editing this article probably right until publication date. The article, and it was a controversial article, called Why There Is No Jewish Narnia. Why no Jewish Narnia? And he made some interesting, sweeping claims about the nature of Judaism and Christianity. And one of his important claims was that Judaism, far less than Christianity, was a story-shaped account of both the individual and the divine. And here, by contrast, you can think of the writings of G.K. Chesterton, right? His very famous 1925 memorable book, The Everlasting Man. The life of man is a story, an adventure story. And we have a vision, the same is true even of the story of God. Chesterton's student or protege in some sense, C.S. Lewis, went on to develop this notion of story as true myth, that the story, the Christian narrative, the Christian revelation is a true myth, and that only Christianity could wed philosophy and narrative in the particular form that it did, and that the rivers of mythology and philosophy are parallel and do not mingle till they meet in the sea of Christendom. That's Chesterton. Well, with all due respect to my friend Michael Weingrad, I'd like to dissent from his distinction between Judaism and Christianity with regard to the place of story, the place of narrative. I think that narrative and story are equally a part of the Jewish revelation, equally a part of the Jewish experience. And I want to share an example or illustrate this principle of the narrative or story-like quality of the Jewish faith with a brief biblical exegesis. I have a Chabad friend, Tzvi Drizin here. Rabbi Drizin is with us today, so he'll appreciate that the first rabbi of Chabad, known as the Alter Rabbi, the old venerable Rebbe, used to say that we have to read the times. We have to look at the times that we're living in and read it through the eyes of Scripture. What he meant was that every week Jews read a Torah portion. Every single Saturday, we read a new portion in the Hebrew Bible, in the 5 books of Moses. And the Bible portions that we're reading now, this period in the late winter, early spring, are anchored by 5 biblical portions, all dealing with the tabernacle in the wilderness. The tabernacle that was commanded by God to Moses to create a dwelling place for the divine presence, for the Shekhinah. And here, anytime you get into sacred architecture, I like to share what the late, great, venerable Rabbi Jonathan Sachs used to say. He used to say that sacred architecture is theology set in stone and wood. That the sacred architecture that each of our traditions have possessed and have developed and have cultivated, each give us a window into a worldview, into a philosophy, into a theology. And I think the philosophy of the tabernacle, of this movable, transitory dwelling place in the desert, can actually show us in clear force and vindicate the claim that the Jewish faith is equally a story with a capital S. The great medieval exegete Nachmanides, in his introduction to the book of Exodus, which is where these Torah portions of the construction of the tabernacle come from, asks an obvious question about the structure of Exodus. Exodus doesn't really hang together in a coherent way. If you think about what happens in the book of Exodus, you have the children of Israel enslaved in Egypt, their redemption, their freedom, the giving of the tablets and the Torah at Sinai, and then the remainder of the book of Exodus deals with the nitty-gritty details of the tabernacle. How many amot, how many hands breadths does the Ark of the Covenant consist of? How many hand breadths is the altar? All these very minutia-oriented, detail-oriented descriptions of the construction of the tabernacle. How does that hang together with what the beginning of the book of Exodus was dealing with the Exodus and the slavery in Egypt? So Nachmanides offers a novel explanation. He says, simply think of the tabernacle as God's return to man. That the tabernacle was the place, the physical, the material, sensual place where God's dwelling was inhered, incarnated, if you will, in the physical world, in the world of man, in the Jewish people. Well, how did the book of Exodus begin? The book of Exodus is a story about a family. First, it's about the universal family, all of humankind, all of mankind, and then it becomes a more focused story about a particular people, a particular tribe, a particular clan. Abraham and Sarah's descendants, Isaac and Rebekah, Isaac and Rebekah's children, Esau and Jacob, and then the 12 tribes. What Nachmanides suggests is that the building of the tabernacle was the true redemption of the Jewish people not getting out of Egypt. That wasn't enough. That was simply their material, physical liberation from bondage. What they needed was a return of the divine presence, the indwelling of God into the heart of the Jewish people, which is the way the Jewish people lived back in Genesis, when God was present always in the tent of Abraham and Sarah. I won't go into the midrashic minutia here, but there are beautiful parallels between the tokens that God had given Sarah and Abraham in their tent and the details of the tabernacle that's built by Moses and Bezalel in the wilderness. But essentially, the tabernacle is a recreation of the tent of Abraham and Sarah. You know, when I was a kid, I was taught that you can't ever sit on a table, that it's just wrong. It's just poor etiquette to sit on a table. And the explanation that I was given was always, well, the table is like an altar. Like an altar to God. You don't sit on a table. It's almost sacrilegious. It's almost blasphemous. But the truth is, with this understanding of the tabernacle and the tent of Abraham and Sarah, the parallelism or the analogy goes in the opposite direction. It's the table that was the source of the original holiness, the table in Abraham and Sarah's tent, that became the altar in the tabernacle and in the temple. So it's the story of Abraham and Sarah. It's the story of the Jewish people that animate the existence of Judaism and the Jewish people, more so even the laws. Of course, Judaism is rife with, we all know, it's rife with laws and details, but that is a corollary, not the cause. It's a corollary of the story. The story is essential. The laws are the corollaries of that story. And if Christianity and Judaism are both stories, not primarily creed or law, then an obvious question needs to be answered. Where does my story, my Jewish story, intersect or include your story, the Christian story? And in answering this question, the truth is that Jews and Christians have really parted company in response to this question of how do each of our stories intersect or overlap with the others. You see, since Christianity's inception in the first century, almost 2 millennia, Christians had a story that accounted for the Jewish story. Jews may not have liked that story at times. We may not have liked what Augustine and Chrysostom have said about where the Jews fit into the Christian story. We would prefer Nostra Aetete and the pontificate of St. John Paul II, of course. But at least there was a story that Christians told of the Jews. But we're in the story in that account. The question I'd like to pose, more to my Jewish compatriots, of course, is what does the Christian story have to do with the Jewish story? In other words, how does the Jewish story account for the Christian story? What does a Jewish story of man say about the Christian narrative or the Christian revelation? I think this is a question that my Jewish colleagues should ask, and I'm grateful to President Sanford and Provost Matthias for allowing me to pose such a question in such wonderful company. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, it's really good to be here. It's really good to be amongst friends on this panel. Rabbi Mark and I have been friends for many years, and Dr. Joshua Perrins and I took a great trip. It was pre-COVID. It was a one-day trip to visit and meet Eric Cohen for the first time, and Rabbi Mitch was talked about at length. I can't remember if you were there. You were this mythic figure, doing all kinds of things, including serving our country in the military. This topic is a really important one. It's obviously near and dear to our hearts at the University of Dallas, and part of what has built the friendships that you will get glimpses into over the next 2 days is that we discovered we've been laboring in the same fields in many respects, maybe different lanes in those fields, right? Tikvah is particularly concerned to build up the intellectual and cultural fabric of Jewish communities, and we're particularly devoted to doing a similar thing within the Catholic communities and all others who participate in our educational venture here. And I wanted to remind everyone that this is not a strange or peculiar thing for Catholics to be engaged in. This is, in fact, drawing from a specifically Catholic perspective, what we are encouraged to do, asked to do, told by Mother Church to do. Okay, and so let me just read a few brief passages from two different documents. One is Nostra Aetate, which is an encyclical issued by Pope Paul VI in 1965. It has binding authority within the Church, and one of the things that is said therein about the particular proximity of the relationship between Catholics and Jews is that the Church, therefore, cannot forget that she received the revelation of what we call the Old Testament through the people with whom God, in his inexpressible mercy, concluded the ancient covenant. Nor can she forget that she draws sustenance from the root of that well-cultivated olive tree, onto which have been grafted the wild shoots, the Gentiles. Indeed, the Church believes that by his cross, Christ, our peace, reconciled Jews and Gentiles, making both one in himself. That's a powerful statement. John Paul II really built a central emphasis of his pontificate on Nostra Aetate, and remarkably expressed on April 13th, 1986, that proximity of the relationship between Catholics and Jews as one of a deep filial bond. The Jews are our elder brothers in the faith. And then in 1999, late April, as he was anticipating the Jubilee year of 2000, John Paul II in a general audience wrote, "Today, the courageous witness of faith should also mark the collaboration of Christians and Jews in proclaiming and realizing God's saving plan for all humanity. If his plan is interpreted in a different way regarding the acceptance of Christ, this obviously involves a crucial difference, which is at the very origin of Christianity itself, but does not change the fact that there are still many elements in common. It is our duty to work together in promoting a human condition that more closely conforms to God's plan. The Great Jubilee of the year 2000, which refers precisely to the Jewish tradition of Jubilee years, points to the urgent need for this common effort to restore peace and justice. Recognizing God's dominion over all creation, particularly the earth, all believers are called to translate their faith into a practical commitment to protecting the sacredness of human life in all its forms and to defending the dignity of every brother and sister." So this is a general encouragement to collaborate, to dialogue, to work together towards common purposes, and a particularly important from the viewpoint of reclaiming our culture for justice, for sanity, for commitment to truth, wisdom, and virtue is the university. I was this morning and last evening part of a conversation at Old Parkland with a number of presidents and chancellors and trustees of a number of universities, wrestling together with the question of how to restore trust in higher education. Okay? The fact that there was this wasn't a public meeting, but this significant conversation on that topic points to the fundamental challenge, at least one of them, affecting higher education. And as I was thinking about a way to frame, I'll mention three particular challenges. The bucket of what has led to this loss of trust it's a big bucket, and there are lots of features to it. I encounter elements of this when I'm talking to prospective students, more often their parents. And I'll just express it this way. College, particularly a liberal arts university, is just not worth it, right? Because it's too expensive. And there are quicker ways to be ready for a career, right? Well, this points to a kind of utilitarian mindset about the purpose of education. It's been decades that universities have been promoting themselves as places to go so that you can get a higher paying job, right? Universities themselves have played into this perspective. Universities have lost their center, right? We've declined significantly from what Newman calls the idea of a university. What's the point of having these different departments? You've got these different research units. They're devoted to the production of knowledge products, and we want to perpetuate research in those fields. What holds these different departments, these different colleges and schools together? Well, largely nothing, except for the kind of organizational structure that allows for the production of degrees in exchange for a monetary investment, which it's true, it's oftentimes quite high. So that has opened space for two other, I think, just complaints that people often have about higher education today. One is that it is a seedbed for ideological intrusion, right? Where instead of wrestling with texts themselves, you are to be programmed to think a particular way. And it's not surprising that many students are eager for some kind of solid meaning because of the divorce of what's going on at an institution of higher education from its founding mission, oftentimes. The center doesn't hold, they're looking for something. And that kind of ideological infection often has its attendant symptom, which is a protest culture, right? But young people want to do important things. They want to rise up and proclaim justice, right? And so we had post October 7th, 2023, that in quite horrific manifestations on many college campuses, the celebration of murder and terrorism. And I remember listening to a few of the interviews with the protesters, and what was evident was that they didn't really understand the issues at hand, right? So in a way, I don't blame many of the young people. They were trying to do something meaningful. They don't have a deep root that the university is presenting them. They're looking for something meaningful. So what is left outside of that? Well, a lot of people are looking for connections. They're looking for a set of experiences. They're looking for high adventure. A kind of general hedonistic lifestyle is often attendant to what it is to be a university student these days. I know that's what a lot of my high school classmates were looking forward to as we were anticipating going to college, right? We're going to go to college, and this was in the days when I never saw this movie, but Animal House had a rather significant influence on the public mind.
You're amongst friends.
Okay. Yeah, that was not like Clinton not ever inhaling. That view of the university, it still lives large in the public mind, and parents ought to say, well, it's not worth it if that's what I'm going to get, right? So this is a problem that I'm gladly able to point to many examples, even at universities that are awash in ideological infections and hedonism. They've got centers, institutes, Catholic study programs, Jewish study programs that provide a kind of center, but those are external to the center that ought to provide the anchor for the whole. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the University of Dallas, I think, is blessedly free from those kinds of problems. But I think there's a real work that needs to be done in reclaiming the idea of the university. And I think it's our task in our various institutions, which are so fundamental to mediating the virtues in our culture, to reclaim their fundamental focus. The second topic, how am I on time?
Just fine. 10 more minutes.
Really, 10 more minutes? I'm the president. I can talk as long as I want, but the second challenge, here's another kind of generic bucket, and Eric could speak to this far better than I'm sure. But I'm thinking about our AI future, the AI challenge, not so much from the perspective of what's happening within colleges and universities today, but the kind of cognitive outsourcing that's happening right now on the junior high and high school level, where so many young people are not learning how to write. That's an obvious thing that we're already attentive to. LLMs make it very easy. Many high school teachers working hard, underpaid. They don't want to do the hard work of making sure that their students are learning to write. Sometimes I know there are many outstanding high school teachers who are really committed to that, but we're also finding more and more young people who don't know how to read a book and might think of reading a book as having the summary of the book, right? So again, dating myself, when I was a kid, there were Cliff Notes, and I went to one of the early classical schools in the country, part of this movement at an early stage, and we were told to never read a commentary on a book, much less touch a Cliff Notes, until we'd really wrestled with the text. I'm really grateful for that training, because reading is not a matter of getting the gist of great work of literature or philosophy or theology or, God forbid, the Bible. Right? Give me the top 20 takeaways from the Old and New Testaments, and I'm sure I could ask Jim and I to do that for me, and I'm sure it would make some sense. But I haven't encountered the living Word of God when I'm getting that kind of summary. So this is going to be a challenge for our universities into the future. How do we teach people how to read books? How do we teach people how to have real conversations? And I think it's going to be the particular task of liberal arts colleges and universities to be attentive to what is possible within the small class room and the engagement that a tutor has with the student. But this AI moment it's also a challenge of the future. And this, in a way, goes into the concerns about college not being worth it. In a way, I think it's a broader concern, right? The future is either terrifying or blessedly utopian, depending on who you talk to, right? So Elon Musk, he's eager to see us all have a universal income. All the work's being done by various types of machines, and then we can do what, right? What seems to animate Elon Musk is like building things and projecting entrepreneurially into the future, right? So if the work's all done, what are you going to do? Well, if you're a philosopher, you think, well, this is perfect, right? There's a lot of work to be done, right? Wrestling with the text, the fundamental work of what one ought to do with his or her leisure time. I don't think that that's our future, and there are lots of reasons why. But there's also the terror of AI, or the fear that AI is going to somehow swallow us whole. And I've been reading quite a bit of work on this and trying to understand. My background is not coding, but my conclusions at this point is we have no legitimate reason to think that an AI machine can think, right? I think John Searle already nailed this with the Chinese room argument. And now we've got more sophisticated machines, but they're not, there's no mental content there. And yet the real danger is the way in which we could be sucked into thinking we're engaging with a thinking other. And Shannon Valor has written on artificial intelligence and the virtues in ways that I find helpful and thought-provoking, at times frustrating, but I find her really helpful. And she frames her latest book called The AI Mirror with a story from Ovid, right? The Pool of Narcissus. You know the story. This young man is gazing into the pool, falls in love with his own reflection, thinking that he is building a relationship with another, and it's unrequited friendship. He languishes and dies. Okay, so, but that actually is a story that encapsulates what AI is. It's the digitized history and various writings of humanity in our past. And what AI cannot do is engage in the fundamental work of directing our actions properly into the future. That is to say, you do not have the possibility of practical wisdom, phronesis, prudence, if you're predicating your approach on an algorithmically based machine system. Of course, no other virtues of the human sort can belong to these machines either, but I think it's particularly pregnant to see this in the case of prudence. So I want graduates of our university, of the various educational institutions that we're connected to, and others to be masters of artificial intelligence, to use it to good effect when appropriate, but not be mastered by it. And I think that if we just do our work well, that fear is met. The last point, and this is maybe the most controversial, is what I'll call second-class citizen Catholicism. And I'm thinking in particular, if you know the history of Catholic universities, of the 1967 Land O'Lakes statement, which was precipitated by a flurry of articles that had come out arguing, in effect, that it's impossible to be in close concert with the magisterium of the Catholic Church and really excellent as a university. And I think it was a peculiarly American movement to feel this kind of self-conviction. We can't be Catholic and excellent because of the peculiarities of the American experience for Catholics. And the irony is a lot of this is driven by a kind of status envy of Harvard and Yale. We need to be like Princeton. And yet those institutions themselves are reflections of what Catholicism was the genesis of. The university is a Catholic creation. And so here we are centuries later envying what happens at institutions that are, in a certain respect, shadows of the original idea of a university. A peculiar thing. We did it to ourselves. Many Catholic universities explicitly divorced themselves from their founding religious communities and from their adherence to the local shepherd. Notre Dame led the charge, Seton Hall, Fordham, others were involved. And, in some ways, those universities have become greater. In other ways, they've lost the thing that made them a university in the first place. And it wasn't until 1990 that John Paul II, a man of the university, issued Ex Corde Ecclesiae to try to pull things back together. And I'll leave it to your own reflections on how successful that effort has been. But what I think is particularly significant for Catholic institutions to do now is to find, in a variety of ways, the evidence for the case, which is, I think, grounded in the very idea of a university, that one ought to be excellent in all the ways relevant to academic excellence precisely because of one's Catholicism. Thank you.
Eric.
Well, let me start by saying it's a great privilege to be here in the landscape of American culture and surely in the landscape of American higher education. The University of Dallas is a real citadel, and it's a privilege to be partners with this great institution as we try to build our own classical education movement and to be a part of a place that is thinking deeply about what it will take to renew and save West and the American experiment in a deeper way. So it's wonderful to be here. The great Jewish intellectual of the 20th century, Milton Himmelfarb, was once asked to offer a simple definition of Judaism. And his definition was, Judaism is against paganism. And it seems to me that's a pretty good definition. As we think about the great civilizational fights and cultural battles that we're enmeshed in right now, and perhaps always enmeshed in different ways, if you want to simplify it, I think you have the Hebraic team and you have the pagan team. And everything else is commentary. Now, I won't try to give a full definition of paganism, but simply observe that there are at least 4 kinds of paganism that Judaism is against, and that I think are prevalent in modern and postmodern culture, and that summon us to return perhaps to our Hebraic and Judeo-Christian roots. The first is the paganism of pleasure. Unbridled sexuality, unbridled worship of food, not just as a source of sustenance and even holiness, but as a kind of art form that ought to be worshipped in itself. There are like 19 food networks now. It's quite an interesting way to entertain yourself. The unbridled forms of music, divorced entirely from music as an act of devotion or an act of beauty, but as paganism in song. And so we have a paganism of pleasure, which reduces the human person, which reduces the human aspiration, which reduces our purposes simply to the unbridled, completely uninhibited pursuit of bodily pleasure. The second kind of paganism is the paganism of progress. And we ought not to be against the kinds of progress that show human creativity at its best. I think we are called to be creative beings in partnership with God. And we ought not to be against progress in the sense that the human story is a story. It's not simply an eternal recurrence of the same. It's not simply a tragic, dark fate. But it is a redemptive story that begins in creation and leads somewhere. We don't know exactly which act we're in. Are we in the early acts of that story, the later acts of that story? We can't always know how it's playing out at any given moment, but those of people of faith have a belief that the human story is moving in a direction. But that's very different than the paganism of progress, which believes that human beings can be the willful agents of our own perfection, that we can cook up various schemes to conquer our condition as human beings, and that the gods of biotechnology, AI, and Karl Marx are going to come together and lead us to the great new utopia. That's a kind of paganism of progress that I think Hebraism and the Jewish people stand firmly against. The third I'll call the paganism of power, but specifically the belief that through the sword, through various forms of tyrannical rule, the great king can not only elevate himself, but can also conquer the rest of mankind and force them to assimilate. The Israelites are a monotheistic people who believe there's a code, but we never sought to conquer all particularities on earth. We believe there's a Noahide code that all human beings ought to adhere to. But there was always, I think, an Israelite understanding of, just as we are a people chosen for a particular purpose, there are other particular peoples. And I think the paganism of power, which can merge with various kinds of religions of empire, perhaps, believes that human beings can conquer the world, elevate the king as God, and through the sword assimilate all to their vision of the human good. I think we're against that. And then finally, perhaps in its purest form, is child sacrifice, right? I mean, the Israelites certainly came to stand against that dark practice in the ancient world. And I don't want to equate what's going on in our culture today with the worst forms of child sacrifice. But I don't know how else one can even begin to contemplate the idea that doctors are now normalizing, abusive surgeries on young children in the name of gender identity. This is insane. And this is a form of child abuse, if not child sacrifice, that certainly is pagan in its spirit and pagan in its origins, even if it's armed with certain modern technologies. So if we think about what are the Jews here to do, well, standing against these four paganisms of pleasure, progress, power, and the abuse of the young, that seems like a pretty good calling. And that leads me to the second set of reflections I want to offer, which is how should we as Jews be thinking about our purpose in trying to strengthen and renew the West? And here too, I'd offer four propositions to think about. The first is we often think about Jerusalem and Athens as these two poles of the West, and I think there's a lot of truth to that way of thinking. I just happen to think Jerusalem's more important, and that it is the Jerusalem way, the Israelite way, that is the moral capital of the West. And so when we think about the fate of Jerusalem as a real place, we should have, I would hope, a deep love and respect for the Jewish people and the miraculous return of the Jews to their own homeland. But I think we should also have a sense that Jerusalem is the moral capital of our civilization, and that we need to preserve it and honor it and elevate it and sanctify it. And Jews certainly have a special responsibility, I think, in preserving that moral core and that moral code that has shaped Western civilization. I'd say second is America is not simply a nation among the nations. I think America is a unique and exceptional nation, and that is covenantal and Hebraic in its origin. I don't think it's an accident that the words emblazoned on the Liberty Bell are proclaim liberty throughout the land, drawn from Hebrew scripture. I don't think it's an accident that Lincoln in his most moving speeches was basically drawing upon Hebraic, Israelite, biblical rhetoric, or that he could understand America as the almost chosen people, because it had a deep connection to the original chosen people, which are the Jews. And so as we think about what America is, I think returning us to our Hebraic spirit and our Hebraic origins is a sacred Jewish responsibility. And it's insane that the most important book in our founding DNA, which is the Bible, is the one book we don't teach in our public schools. That makes a lot of sense if you're a civilization interested in continuity. So I think Jews have a unique responsibility in trying to summon America back to our Hebraic roots. I'd say third, as is often the case, Jews are sometimes the leading edge of certain civilizational fights. I think we've seen this in the horrendous protests and assaults and misdeeds on many college campuses since the horrible attacks of October 7th, which is fundamentally an attack by leftists and Islamists against America using Jews as their instrument. That is what is going on. And so Jews are often the kind of test case for whether a civilization is healthy or not. And I think the question of the Jews' flourishing and survival in America is the most important test case for whether our culture will renew or erode. Because if Jewish communities can't pass down the particularities of their faith commitments, if Jewish schools can't flourish, if Jews can't continue to live with the religious freedom that has always been at the heart of the American experiment, then America is in trouble and the West is in trouble. So as goes American Jewry, so goes America. We are the test case for the health of this civilization. And we should take that as a responsibility and see it in those terms. And then finally, I think we ought to take seriously the elder brothers in faith formulation of our relationship with Christianity. I will not try to answer Mark's question of what is the Jewish theology of Christianity. I'll let him do that. But I do think Jews have a role as, at our best, both learners from Christianity, but also teachers and reminders of certain things. And the simplest way I put it is the Old Testament's a pretty important part of your book. And you should go the Marcionite route at your own peril. And it's important not only because it's the beginning of your own story, but because there's a certain realism about the human condition that is embedded in that book that ought to be forgotten at your own peril. And a notion of love completely divorced from law, a notion of love completely divorced from the realities of good and evil and sometimes the necessity of force, that's a problem. And Christianity ought to remember those Old Testament lessons. And perhaps we as Jews are here to sort of remind you of that. And also here as a kind of loving reminder of the importance of Christian humility. Because there have been times in history, I could spend many hours critiquing the Jewish people. There have been times in history where a kind of triumphalist streak in Christianity has not turned out well. And so what we need, I think, is a new era of Christian and Jewish friendship, because we are the Hebraic team that alone can stand against the civilizational struggles that we face. I'll end with just a nod to classical education. I know it's a subject for the panel ahead, but it's also the partnership that brought our two institutions together. And here I know we have so much to learn from you as we try to build a Jewish classical education movement. And so I just want to take up in a final thought, why classical for the Jews? Meaning we have our own traditions of teaching and learning. We have our own modalities of education. If you walked into a yeshiva, you'd see a kind of half magical, half insane picture of people yelling and screaming and teaching in what looks like the chaotic, careful study of texts. And it's hard to appreciate or even understand if you haven't lived it. But we also know we have much to learn from you. And I would say, why classical? I'll give my Jethro answer and my Isaiah answer. My Jethro answer is that even Moses had to learn the arts of governance from Jethro, right? In a period of, where he was not being wise about what it was going to take to be a great leader. It was Jethro who taught him the arts of delegation. And I think in a deeper sense, it's a metaphor for the importance that Jews should have of learning from other parts of the Western tradition, things where they can be our teacher. Now, I think on the deepest things, it's the Jews who should be teaching the West. But I also think when it comes to things like power, we ought to read Thucydides. When it comes to things like the free economy, we ought to read Adam Smith. When it comes to things like the nature of preserving tradition in an untraditional age, we ought to read Edmund Burke. And so we have to learn from our Jethros. And I think the classical tradition at its best is where that kind of education is being embodied. But I'll also end with my Isaiah answer, which is, if Jews have a purpose, it's ultimately to be a light unto the nations, not only a people apart. Now, being to some degree a people apart is what enables us to be a light unto the nations. And so if we give up entirely on being a people apart, then we're not fulfilling our mission or our destiny. But our ultimate purpose is to be a light unto the nations. And I think part of how we will be that light is by partnering with those classical institutions, including Christian, who can carry some of this spirit to a much larger market, to the world. And I hope in that there'll be a little bit more of a nudge toward the Jerusalem side from the Greco-Roman side of the classical school curriculum, but that's a story for the next panel, perhaps. But I do think at bottom, the classical ed movement, and at a deeper level, the partnership with Christianity has something. I won't try to answer Mark's question. It would be hubristic to have a theology of Christianity. I would be practicing without my theology license here. But I do think this friendship has something to do with bringing Hebraism to the world at a moment when it is needed most. And I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Rich, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this. It's really, really wonderful. I do want to say just at the outset something about our master's program in Jewish classical education, which we are conducting with Tikvah. It's been an amazing accomplishment so far. And did Paul just step out? Sorry, I wanted to name. Paul Weinhold has, of course, been carrying the heavy lifting for us on our side. But we really cherish the work that we're doing together. I think it's very important, and we look forward to many years of collaboration. So I want to mention two particular areas of concern in our challenges in our contemporary society, especially to higher education. One is the danger of anti-intellectualism. And the second is what I will call the leveling of the intellectual playing field. I'll try to explain what I mean by that. But I'm actually going to conclude with 4 solutions. So 2 problems, 4 solutions. Right? Usually I only identify problems. Okay, so first, anti-intellectualism. Many of you, of course, will be aware of various presidential candidates over the past decade or more who have articulated a wariness of higher education, promoting instead the notion that more students would be better off learning a trade than wasting their time in college. My favorite example of this comes from then Senator Marco Rubio in 2016, in one of his stump speech lines about higher education, where he said this: "For the life of me, I don't know why we have stigmatized vocational education. Welders make more money than philosophers. We need more welders and less philosophers." Right? I take it as part of his popular appeal to say less philosophers and not fewer philosophers. And then he said, "I said it last night, a welder makes a lot more than a philosopher, and it's a lot easier to find a job. There are a lot more openings for welders than philosophers in America today." And then later, in April of 2016, he quipped that, talking about the economic prospects for philosophy majors, he says, "The market for Roman philosophers has tightened significantly." Take that personally, I teach Roman philosophy. But anti-intellectualism has a healthy pedigree. And the problem is that it ultimately undermines, I will say, the maintenance or restoration of civilizational order. Sometimes this position is covered by economic concerns, as it is in part today, about student loans or student debt. So the federal government now and several state governments have been for some time addressing this question of student debt, originally aiming at for-profit schools that, in the government's view, were insufficiently concerned or transparent about the costs that students were incurring or what the financial future might hold for them. But this is an understandable reaction to where the academic life has gone of late, as some others have noted. The modern world, including the modern university, or perhaps mostly the modern university, has lost sight of the pursuit of wisdom, often pursuing instead the kind of narrow knowledge that marks one as a scholar, or worse, as an intellectual. Here we might bear in mind the thoughtful lines from W.H. Auden on the intellectual. He wrote, "To the man in the street, who I'm sorry to say is a keen observer of life, the word intellectual suggests right away a man who's untrue to his wife." We need to show that's not universally true. But the main point, the major point is this: the future, like the past, is a struggle over ideas. And you don't beat bad ideas with no ideas or with other bad ideas. You overcome bad ideas with good ideas, or at least better ideas. And so what that means in practice is, at a place like this, we need faculty who can teach our curriculum. And we need students who are willing and able to do the work that our curriculum demands of them. Okay, second problem, I take it, is what I'll call this like a laziness or flattening of the very idea of the acquisition of knowledge and wisdom. This may actually be something related to the second point. I don't know if it might be a deepening of the first point, or it's the complete opposite. I'll let you decide. Let me begin by saying something about what I think is related to this is the discussion over trigger warnings, which has been going on for some time, of course. And I'll give you just one recent example. The University of Nottingham in 2024 attached a trigger warning to the Canterbury Tales, of course being taught in the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer himself, at the end of the Tales, wrote this. Authorship of the line is disputed, in case Greg Roper's here. He wrote a retraction of some of his racier works, in which he asked readers to, quote, pray that Christ have mercy on him and forgive him for some of his work dedicated to worldly vanities. That was not the concern of the University of Nottingham. Their concern was aimed at a different issue, raising awareness that the work contained descriptions, quote, of violence and mental illness, unquote, and, quote, expressions of Christian faith, unquote. Apparently, Britain's university youth require a heads up that medieval literature might touch upon religious themes. But trigger warnings are designed in part, I think, to put one on edge, to place a marker on the text or author such that the reader or student is intended to steel themselves against some dangerous or harmful language, image, or theme that's somehow understood to be a threat to them. And I will note, the impulse driving that is not always a bad one. There are dangerous ideas. There are harmful arguments and images that can and do have a powerful influence on us. And there are reasons to be sensitive to the circumstances that some of our students find themselves in. And in fact, I favor trigger warnings. For this reason, young people love to be told that something is edgy and nonconformist. Every book we teach should come with a warning label. This book can change your life. And much of what I'm thinking about here is actually the stage for it was really set by Descartes. So I'm not going to read the passage, but it's sort of what I call the flattening of intellects, right? And that flattening or equality of intellects, it comes with a corollary for him, and I think most others following in his train, and that is the rejection of authority as a source of knowing. It is precisely the rejection of authority that constitutes the principal stage in the advancement of knowledge. As Descartes writes, nothing conduces more to the acquiring of a firm and assured knowledge of things than a preliminary accustoming of ourselves in the doubting of all things. But that leveling tends to produce this dangerous conclusion. If I can't know it, it can't be known. That produces a pride in the intellect that will prevent the acquisition of knowledge and produce a dangerous envy among those who see others who seem to have surpassed them. One of the additional dangers of the leveling is that people are not encouraged to do the work, the hard preparatory effort that lays the groundwork for the growth and development necessary to advance our collective good. Perhaps this might clarify what I'm driving at here. So I'm going to use Flannery O'Connor as a nod to our visitor. In a 1957 lecture, Flannery O'Connor addressed the question of censorship by the Catholic Church, thinking in particular then of the still in existence Index of Prohibited Books. So here is what she wrote about the job or role of a Catholic writer. So this is O'Connor. The business of protecting souls from dangerous literature belongs properly to the church. She's saying, not to me as the writer. She says, all fiction, even when it satisfies the requirements of art, will not turn out to be suitable for everyone's consumption. It's a bold claim. And if in some instance the church sees fit to forbid the faithful to read a work without permission, the author, if he is a Catholic, will be thankful that the church is willing to perform this service for him. It means that he can limit himself to the demands of art, right? But then she notes how the editors of America magazine, which published the speech that was originally a speech she gave, they rewrote that paragraph to read as follows. The author must, of course, it's published under her name, but this is how they rewrote it. The author must, of course, realize that it is his function, no less than it is a function of the church, to protect souls from dangerous literature. That's not what she said, right? But then the America version goes on. But in striving to live up to the legitimate requirements of art, he will know that not all fiction will turn out to be suitable for everyone's consumption. And then concludes, If in some instances the church sees fit to forbid the faithful to read a work without permission, the Catholic author will be thankful that he has been recalled to a sense of responsibility. That is exactly not what she's saying. Right? The editors take it that the writer should alter, they say his, I'll say her, art, as a way of taking care of the good of the reader. But that's not O'Connor's point. She's saying that as a writer, she writes, and she's true to the craft and the material. It's then up to others, she says, to decide who could or should read her work, and she's fine with that. She has no problem with that at all. One danger, of course, of the writer censoring herself is that you probably will get bad writing. Right? And that bad writing will come at the behest of a desire to level the intellects of the potential audience. We had a panel discussion recently of IPS student. We're talking about poetry, and I suggested to literature faculty that they might teach a course on bad poetry. What makes it bad? There's got to be bad poetry. After all, there's a lot of mediocre readers, so there should probably be mediocre poetry. Okay, 4 solutions to our problems. 1, don't take your bearings by the world's measuring points. John Tracy Ellis wrote a famous essay in 1955 called American Catholics and the Intellectual Life, which appeared in the journal Thought, and then it was published in pamphlet form. Hundreds of thousands of copies of it were sold, widely circulated, and it's a fine work, and it's still worth reading. But when Ellis takes Catholic scholars and intellectuals to task for what we might call their underperformance in society, often the gauge he uses for measuring that is completely secular and often state-driven. That is, how many Catholics have received funding from mainstream foundations and government bodies. One might ask, though, whether Catholics should measure their commitment to the intellectual life on that basis, that is, by the number of state-funded grants that they've received. Of course, there's something to be said for taking solace in having received such funding, and it's certainly some kind of mark for the individual and the institution. But since Ellis has articulated already in the essay the long history of anti-Catholicism in America, one would have to take with a grain of salt reliance on such measures as a way of gauging the importance of the Catholic role in promoting the intellectual life. And in addition, of course, once we accept that standard, Catholics themselves will begin measuring themselves by that standard. But why should we not imitate the leaders of the scholarly world in pursuing the kind of funding and scholarly interest that characterizes so much of the academy today? Well, I might use an example from my own field to illustrate that. I teach politics. Suppose that the country was in a particularly difficult strait, that there was a looming world war or a serious policy matter that threatened to upset the political and social order in such a way that the results might range from troubling to catastrophic. I take it for granted that no presidential advisor, no business executive, no religious leader would think that the way to begin our considerations about what plan of action to take in preventing or dealing with the aftermath of such a crisis would be, why don't we get together the top 50 political scientists in the country and ask their advice? No sane person would begin that way. Why not? Wouldn't you expect that? We don't expect it. We don't expect it. Many of our leading authoritative bodies have, for various reasons, simply lost the capacity to lead and lost the respect that would be crucial in providing leadership. Second solution, to stand stalwart in defense of those who are seeking a different path. We got to promote, I think, pay attention to and promote the many small movements across the country that are looking for breaths of fresh air, that are concerned about their families and their children's education and their health care and their churches. You can't miss it in the resurgence of parental care for their children or small entities seeking refuge from the dominant strains of our culture. Now, these groups, true, often go awry or splinter themselves up or latch on to some supposed scheme that will claim to provide them solace, and it won't. We should seek to provide those movements with some structure and bearings so they don't run amok among the challenges of the contemporary world. Many people of goodwill have come to think that the world has lost its collective mind and that their only hope is to cut themselves off from society and from others. And we may recognize that that is best a short-term solution. They may be convinced that it's the only solution. There may be some element of truth in their analysis, But I think we should assure them that the proper response to the palpable decay they see around them is not isolation or rejection of the common good. It is instead to recognize that human beings are naturally social beings and that we find our good most often through the fundamental institutions of society, the family, the church, and the common good of society. Third, preserve and promote the best of what we wish to encourage. I want to mention here a remarkable book published about 15 years ago by Jacob Howland, titled Plato and the Talmud. Howland in the book was addressing the passing on of traditions of learning. And he mentions, not altogether in passing, I take it, the percentage of Jewish scholars lost during the Holocaust, especially in Poland. And he mentions that by one estimate, the Holocaust, quote, claimed the lives of over 80% of Jewish scholars, rabbis, full-time students, and teachers of Torah alive in 1939. It's a remarkable number. This is most important to the task he is concerned about in the book, in particular, ferreting out the true meaning of the Talmud. And I wonder about its broader consequences. Modern Europe was devastated already prior to the 20th century in terms of its heritage of inspired learning and social order by revolutions both secular and religious, which led to the dismantling and fragmenting of many longstanding institutions, political, social, religious, and educational. When you add to that the loss of so many teachers and students of Torah, one might wonder what are the consequences for that tradition of reading and study that Professor Howland is describing in his book. What are the prospects? What are our prospects for recovering from that devastation? I have no complete answer to that question, but I have at least a partial answer. Those of us who are privileged to toil in institutions like the University of Dallas need to continually be reminded that we're paying off a debt to those who came before us. We're called to be faithful to the mission of St. Paul in 1 Corinthians, for I've received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you. We fulfill our calling in part by standing in defense of our heritage and tradition against the tide of the challenges of modern culture. But we do so not merely to try to stem the tide. We're also called on to reflect on the nature of our culture and provide some way out of the difficulties and challenges that we find. And this is not a short-term task, but a long-term one. And we can do that in part by recognizing and honoring those who have made signal contributions to that task. And we do that in part through events like this. Last point, be honest about the task in front of us. Dr. Sanford has mentioned one of the challenges of persuading people to come to the University of Dallas is persuading their parents who perhaps have not had the education we have to offer that they should come. They should send their children here. After all, nothing is cheap. But what does that mean? Well, it means that we have to be awake to that question, right? We have to be aware of it and figure out a way of articulating our sense, right, of why people should be taking advantage of what we have to offer. So we can't always or only be guided by the higher and more profound principles. So here I recall what I said at the beginning about the jocular criticism of the study of philosophy. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the mean annual wage of welders in 2024 was $51,000, for plumbers, $62,000, for teachers of philosophy and religion, $74,000. So, while we don't need to denigrate welding and plumbing, we don't want to hold out that, and we don't want to hold out that one should study philosophy or theology because it pays well. It doesn't hurt our cause to be aware of such things. We have a noble goal, and we're being counted on by a host of others to lead the way on our common mission, and we have to do what we do, and we have to do it well. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists. Since we already advanced in time, I open the floor right away to any questions from the audience. Or absent that, questions of the panelists to each other. Yeah.
Mark, what is the Jewish
Yeah, I would start with the common sense observation that Christianity improved the world. In other words, even from a Jewish point of view, the spread of Christianity through the ancient Mediterranean basin and from there into Europe, Northern Europe, West, East, brought God's word and God's wisdom to a far larger audience, population, community than what the Torah did simply through the Jewish people, of God incarnate, let's say, in the Jewish people. So I could begin from that common sense observation and then wed to certain Jewish prophecies of the word of God being acknowledged by the nations, that Christianity and possibly, even if you want to be very bold, you can say that the miracles, specifically the resurrection, was the key for the pagan peoples to accept Christ as their savior. So in a very condensed version, and I'm speaking more from my reading of Jewish tradition and my reading of world history and the West, that a Jew might be able to say that Christianity is the spread of Jewish learning and life to the Gentile peoples in a salvific way. That's obscuring a lot of the details, and it's consciously evading some of the very specific doctrinal questions. But that would be in a nutshell. That would be the case in a nutshell, that Judaism was able to contagion-like engage the West and the broader world of Gentile civilization through Christianity. I think you also want to wed this observation about the world to a claim about prophecy and revelation, that God speaks, in different languages. This doesn't have to result in a relativism. It can, and it often does, and the softer versions. But the hard-headed versions might allow for the idea that there's this revelatory voice that is constantly coming to Sinai, but it's being channeled through different traditions, through different peoples, through different personalities. And Christianity is God's providential way of life and salvific way of life for the Gentile nations of the world. That it was an expansion of God's revelation, an expansion of his role as father. I mean, even without Christianity, God is the father of all mankind. That's Genesis. But a salvific, redemptive relationship, that's something new. And I think that some of the most daring Jewish thinkers move in that direction. It's still a minority point of view, definitely on the margins, but that would be a quick cut at your question.
Please.
I would just note where you started Maimonides'
Yeah.
argument.
Yeah, the difference. What Maimonides acknowledges is the spirit of what I just said. But if you read Maimonides, as I know, Josh, you do carefully, Maimonides also says theologically this is still false. So, in other words, Maimonides is not prepared to make a ab initio or a priori claim about the facticity, certainly not of the miracles of Christ, but even the truth content of the faith. It happened to anthropologically or sociologically or historically bring God's word, and it therefore was a preparatorio evangelicum of sorts, preparation for the eventual conversion of all peoples to the one God. But it is Maimonides, yes, which is a good person to hang your hat on. You want to hang your hat on someone like Maimonides. But to be honest, you have to at least acknowledge the full citation.
Maybe if I may add a question onto that, and that is, and this year marks the 20th anniversary of the Pope Benedict's speech the University of Regensburg,
Yes.
that caused a lot of controversy about.
More in the Islamic world than in the Jewish world.
Exactly. So and it
No
emphasized.
protests by the Jews to
Mhm.
the Regensburg speech.
Right, but I think it's an interesting question in light of that speech there, in which Pope Benedict emphasized the importance of reason, and it's necessary conjunction with faith, and the timeliness of Christ's birth into a culture that had developed, the exercise of reason
Sure,
as
the
it
Greek,
was, right?
He's very worried about the Hebraization or the de-Greek, the de
He is.
Greek,
De-Hellenization.
the de-Hellenization of Christianity in that lecture.
Exactly. So, but I do wonder, I mean, do you see the kind of companionship of Christian, Catholic on the one hand, and Jewish philosophical, educational, cultural efforts that share the same commitment to the Logos, right? As a gift from God to human beings, that is an essential element in the attempt to, well, if you want to write the story that is our story in relation to the story of God with us.
I mean, Jews love ideas, and Jews love to argue, and Jews love all the things that ratio and logos really connote and suggest. So I think there's a lot to say about that particular lecture, and I owe my own whatever my own perspectives on the Regensburg Address. My dear friend R.J. Snell, who's here today with us, is certainly the major driver in my own engagement with that text.
Mm-hmm.
We've taught that text together for many, many years in a course called The Nature of Reason,
Mm-hmm.
In Jewish and Western sources. So look, it's a great address. It's very valuable for a reconsecration of the university in terms of making claims that reason is decisive in our thinking. It's not all relativism. It's not all choice and subjectivism, but also that the specific disciplines, including theology, belong in a university setting. I think Jews and Christians, we would probably challenge some of the theoretical commitment to logos that
Mhm.
speech offers. But practically, Jews live better than we think on this issue because we are so engaged in the enterprise of logos and reasoning and deduction and making arguments from truth, corollaries,
Mhm.
and consequences. So I think to make logos the driving force eclipsing the story, I think is problematic.
Mhm.
But to see logos as at the created level of being as one of the defining features of man and very essential in that theological anthropology, of course, there's so much overlap and there's so much shared work with Jews and Catholics,
Yeah.
specifically with regard to logos.
Which seems to me particularly important in a time of unreason.
Yes,
Yes.
we need to return.
Yeah, no, I was, thank you for that question. I was also thinking about Eric's eloquent articulation of against paganism as a way to understand Judaism, not exhaustively, but in terms of particularly its cultural force. And the task before us is, as you put it, the reconstitution of the university, the reconstitution of the family, the reconstitution of neighborhoods that are really promoting the common good, reconstitution of many additional institutions in our broader culture. And Augustine uses this image drawn from Exodus of the Israelites making their way out of Egypt, and they rob the spoiling of the Egyptians, right? And this becomes for him the leading image within Western civilization.
Classic,
of
yeah.
wherever one goes, you can find nuggets, you can find earrings, you can find
Appropriation
appropriation
of materials that
that's right.
at their core may be problematic or maybe at best neutral, but to use them, that they built from the gold and silver, they built the tabernacle.
Right.
That's exactly
I always,
that was the source of the materials.
But they
of the tabernacle.
may have first built the
golden calf. Yes,
right.
they did.
But
there's a whole question. There's a dispute between Maimonides and Nachmanides. Was the commandment to build the tabernacle in the wilderness, did it precede the golden calf, or did it take place as a consequence of the golden calf?
Yeah.
So,
but my question is, like, what are the differences in the way that we think about our fundamental commitment to reforming culture through education when it comes to the appropriation, which is different than assimilation, and a further theology of Christianity for Jews and vice versa might discover some differences, but I'm interested in the similarities at this point.
And I'll just add, I'm in the sort of two cheers for reason camp, but we have to, I think, also reckon with the limits of reason. And I think there's a very interesting debate about what is the deepest purpose of a university. Is it free inquiry or is it formation? Those can live together, but one has to ultimately win. Meaning, is the university fundamentally simply a well-curated buffet of the human alternatives, or is it actually exists to pass down an inheritance in a thoughtful, responsible way? And if I understand it correctly, University of Dallas is clearly on one side of that debate, and from my point of view, the right side. Now, the formative side, the formation side. That was self-evident. And look, when the universities have become hotbeds of irrationality, waving the flag of free speech and free inquiry is at least better. And when universities have become indoctrination camps where almost everyone on the faculty has a certain worldview, then waving the flag of pluralism is better than what we have. But Mill is not going to be our savior here. Moses is a better path and a better guide to what a university.
Moses University of Dallas. Moses, not Mill.
And at the deepest level, to just be difficult, I think in the capacity of reason to discern the moral good or the metaphysical truth of things, I think Stoicism and Hebraism would fight to a draw if we didn't have the Bible. And so we can use reason to think our way out of all kinds of nihilisms, but I'm not sure reason alone gives us a clear victory over Stoicism, or a sense that the human condition is fundamentally a problem of endurance of tragedy as opposed to a redemptive story. And so there, I think reason disconnected from the covenantal story, reason disconnected from the Hebrew Bible or the Judeo-Christian tradition, I think we can overestimate how far it can take us. And I think we have to be sort of commanded first and then reason our way through what that summons demands of us. That's why I think, Jerusalem wins over Athens.
I have to add this because we're at the University of Dallas. So one of the first essays I read when I was a teenager was by Frederick Wilhelmsen. Oh, Fritz Wilhelmsen, come on, we got to get some claps for that here. So that his article is Great Books, Enemy of Truth, right? That was I think that's the title.
Education. Enemy of education.
Enemy of Education. So that very much spoke to your point, Eric, that this Millian conception, you never even read the essay, but you channeled it very well. And, I think that, Patrick Pack-Denide wrote an updated version in First Things called Against Great Books. It has to be reason reason needs to be situated, and situated reason or a situated form of reason has to be within a tradition, which is not then pure reason in some more abstract theoretical. It has to be embedded in a culture, embedded in a tradition, embedded in a set of practices. So I think this is an interesting part where, more traditional Thomists would even part company with more 20th century phenomenologists like our friend Dietrich van Hildebrand, So we'd get into questions of that, the epistemology really of reason and situatedness, but that would take us far afield. But I think that would be a little bit of a safeguard against the reason, capital R.
And I like that framing. Both of you have reflected on, if not a Christian, I'd be a Stoic, right? And if not a Jew, you'd be a Stoic, right? From the competitive set of arguments, but there's got to be a grounding in what's been revealed, what's been given, and that takes you far beyond that limit of reason.
Well, I would say the real rival would be, and the worthy one, Neoplatonism. But that's a different story.
You would.
So maybe a final question for you, Richard, and that is, I never forget this line of Marco Rubio's. I think I remember though with the plumber, but he may have changed professions there. Yeah, there was a Joe the plumber at the time, I think. So anyway, my father was a plumber, so I'm a philosopher. There's no necessary exclusion. Is that I don't know. He did many things that I don't do, so I'm unable to do. And anyway, so but I'm wondering. These kinds of anti-intellectual tendencies and that laziness that you're describing that are dangerous today, they're old, right? They seem to reoccur again and again. I'm thinking, maybe Marco Rubio read Republic and that's the Thales of the Republic, and he didn't read Aristotle, and so he missed the Thales of Aristotle, right? That did a prudent investment and made a lot of money. So
he's defending reading Aristotle.
I am.
You have it on tape.
Yeah.
They're
That's right. So what are the lessons, maybe, if any, that we can draw from history of such cultural trends that can help us today?
Yeah, I do think it's the case that it's a cyclical matter. And I think that, the history of it is, there's the phenomenon that we've seen since, in post-World War II America is just unknown historically, right? The huge explosion of higher education, which is, made possible in part by the GI Bill, but also in part by general wealth in the population. The idea that, 100 years ago, I asked my students in class, how many of you grew up on a farm? None of them. 150 years ago, virtually all of them would have been on some form of farm. We don't know any, we're so distant from that, and it happened very quickly. And so there, I would say that's not cyclical. We might see 500 years from now that it is part of it. But I do think that the anti-intellectualism is in large part animated by political or social opposition to what they see universities standing for. And you talked to someone about that. Why would I think this is a reason why people of faith in higher education today find themselves attracted to STEM fields. Because it's right or wrong. Right? You don't have all of that other stuff, right? Flavoring of the story that you're getting. It's there, and so I think many of our brightest students are in fact attracted to STEM because of that. That's fine. I don't think they want to do STEM. That's fine. But we're losing them on the humanities side, and I think that's a great loss.
Could I just maybe defend Marco Rubio here?
Go ahead.
Meaning, in part because he's the great political hope of the country at the moment, and we ought to respect him. And you can't have watched or read his recent speech in Munich and not understand, like, there are fewer, more articulate defenders of the West than we have today. So what was he doing in this? Well, he was running for president. But what is the deeper, I think, insight of his plumbing, not philosophy? It's, I think, that the humanities and the universities had degraded themselves. They had turned philosophy into a tool and an art of undermining and undoing the culture, and then stiffing the country with the bill. That's not healthy. And so, at least when you, at the New Atlantis, I published one of the most famous articles we ever published, was called "Shop Class as Soulcraft." And it makes a stirring defense that the guys who are building things actually, in many ways, have a much deeper philosophical understanding of reality than, you know, the 5-cent analytical and postmodern philosophers that populate our universities today. And so it's a crude populist slogan, I grant that. But I think has an insight that the universities have made the humanities, the study of philosophy, a negative in the quest for the good life, and a negative in the formation of souls, not a positive. It's also, I think, a sober recognition that classical liberal education, certainly in its higher forms, was never meant to be a mass form of education, right? And so there are forms of formation through religion that are meant to be for everybody. I think it's at least a legitimately interesting discussion whether the careful study of Plato is an indispensable necessity for most people. Is it what will form them as good citizens, as good fathers, as responsible, decent human beings? Or is the liberal arts, rightly understood, meant to be for those who are the guardians of the culture and are in positions of civic leadership or of all kinds? And I think that's an interesting debate, an interesting discussion. But I think and I don't want to defend anti-intellectualism, and I actually think, you know, your argument is powerful and profound. I'm not trying to be contentious, but I do think we should at least honor the plumber who lives with dignity as a higher form of human life than the philosopher whose purpose is to destroy the country and the culture. And too many of our philosophers, that's what they're doing. And the plumbers are paying for the default on the loans. And that's not right. And that's, I think, was what was at the heart of that comment. And it should be read as a challenge to the universities to do what they're supposed to do and to make philosophy worthy of studying again. That's what happens here. That's not what happens in most universities.
I completely agree with everything you said. Yeah, right.
I figured.
Especially as someone who spends maybe a little bit too much time in the shop myself.
And as someone who can put together nothing, I'm just confessing my own inadequacy.
Well, I recommend it.
Okay, good. I in my retirement.
On this concordial note, we conclude our first panel. Thank you to all our panelists for their contributions, for the questions, and the discussion. There's some refreshments outside. We'll reconnect at 3:30.
Thank you. Like you, I got to run into a board call.